Hello and welcome back to the Whole Life podcast. My name's Grace Fielding.
And I'm Paul Woolley, and today we're talking about race.
Thank you so much for joining us again, everyone. It's good to be with you. How are you doing today, Paul? I hear a little croak in your voice.
I have a cold, indeed, but I'm being obviously naturally very resilient
Well done.
to all, stoical, in fact. And I do think stoicism is underrated, I feel.
There we go.
I think we need to recover some stoicism within our culture. How are you?
I'm very well. Yeah, I haven't got a cold, but I would say I'm still a reasonably resilient person, even without
Oh, yes,
without a cold.
absolutely.
Anyway, enough about us, Paul. This podcast is not about us today, or any day, actually, is it? Today, as Paul said, we are talking about race. The subjects of race and ethnicity dominate the media, occasionally positively, but more often negatively. The murder of George Floyd in the United States back in May 2020 sparked a series of riots and demonstrations against police brutality. In the UK, there was a renewed focus on the experience of Black people, especially in a majority white country, given Britain's colonial past and with issues of racial justice. But the UK is increasingly ethnically diverse. In fact, about 20% of the population belong to Black, Asian, mixed, or other ethnic groups. We've recently had an Asian Prime Minister, an Asian First Minister in Scotland, the first Muslim leader of any Western nation, a Black First Minister in Wales, and we still have an Asian and Muslim Mayor of London.
But the question we're really interested in focusing on today, Grace, is how the Christian story can help frame our understanding and indeed our behaviour when it comes to questions of race and ethnicity. That's what we want to explore, and I'm delighted that we have Chine McDonald with us today to help us explore that topic. Chine read theology at Cambridge University before training as a journalist. She is now director of the excellent think tank Theos. Chine is a regular media commentator and contributor to BBC religion and ethics programmes, including Thought for the Day. And she is author, among other things, of God is Not a White Man, which was published by Hodder and Stouter in 2021. Chine, thank you so much for joining us today on the Whole Life podcast. It's really great to have you on.
Thank you for
How are you
having
doing?
me. Great, thank you.
Well, Chine, as we kick off, we would love to get to know you a bit. Obviously, Paul has given a bit of an intro to you, but I wonder as we start if you'd be willing to give us a kind of short biography, a whistle-stop biography, let's call it, of yourself as a Black woman growing up in the UK.
Yes, so I was born in Lagos in Nigeria, Africa's most populous city. If anyone's been there, it's busy. I was born there and moved to the UK when I was 4 years old. My dad was part of that kind of group of Nigerian immigrants to the UK in the 1980s. So my mum, my dad, and myself and my two sisters, we moved to the UK when I was 4 years old. We moved to London, Southeast London, where I have spent most of my life, kind of Southeast London, and the home counties, but predominantly in white majority spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to white majority schools. I went to a very white university. Throughout my education, I didn't ever have a Black teacher
Wow.
or lecturer. And I also have spent most of my church years in white majority churches. So kind of my context within the UK, growing up as a Black woman, has been often just very familiar with that feeling of being the only Black person in a room or one of very few. And I think that's kind of framed my experience. So yeah, that's me. Also kind of worked in the media for a little bit. And at the time when I trained as a journalist after having studied theology, still very dominated by an old boys network of white men.
Yep.
And now lead a Westminster think tank, also very white dominated. So yeah, so that's kind of been my experience.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And we'll come on a little bit later to, maybe your experience in some of those places and spaces that you've described. But to kind of dive straight into the the issue, I suppose. Could I start by asking you to kind of give your assessment on the state of the nation? Obviously, I'm aware that's a very big question, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of to what extent you feel like racism and this idea of white supremacy is a problem, and whether, you know, that's sort of in the past, but actually more so sort of currently in the UK.
Yeah, this is a really difficult question because clearly there have been different waves, I guess, of race relations, even in my lifetime. One thing I hadn't mentioned yet was I was living in Eltham in southeast London, and I was 9 years old when Stephen Lawrence was killed, kind of around the corner from where I lived. If you think about that time in history, the kind of early 90s, what we saw in the areas in which I lived was the kind of rise of the far right, the kind of skinheads, kind of racism seemed to be quite, you know, prominent, and there had been lots of instances of, I guess, scuffles, violence between white groups and black groups. So Stephen Lawrence very much framed my kind of childhood understanding of what it was to be black in the UK. Now we are 4 years on from the murder of George Floyd, which was, it's almost like it's a kind of very defining moment in race relations in the UK, because it almost feels like we talk about before George Floyd and after George Floyd, because I'd say in the year or two after that, we were talking about race and racial injustice in a way that I had never experienced. We were seeing people almost becoming awake and alive to the fact that actually we thought that we had moved far beyond these issues, but actually the reality for many black people in the UK and in white majority countries around the world was still very much one in which it was possible for a black man to be killed by predominantly white police officers. So I think the kind of couple of years after that saw, I think, a real acceleration and movement on these issues. I saw white church leaders on Black Lives Matter marches that I hadn't seen before, lots of invitations to speak about race within churches and organizations. But I'd say that over the past couple of years, as we've seen lots of political upheaval and an increasingly polarized society, racism, diversity has become entangled with basically the culture wars, and almost kind of wrapped into those conversations, so that it has become something else entirely. We're kind of almost distracted from the actual issues, but it becomes a kind of touch point at which you decide where someone is politically. And interestingly, in that time, over the past couple of years, as was mentioned at the start, we've seen lots of black and brown people rise to prominence within political leadership. The Conservative government had a significant number of cabinet members who were from ethnic minorities, but it almost felt like they had to play into these culture wars themselves. So yeah, interesting with a kind of new government that is less diverse and has its own issues in terms of race, but the difference that those significant roles might make for the black and brown communities in the UK themselves, I think is something to be discussed.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting, and kind of really helpful just to kind of have a bit of I suppose, a summary of the state of things at the moment, especially in terms of, yeah, as you say, sort of society, politics. I wonder if we could think a little bit about church. So you mentioned in your kind of your little biography at the start about how you kind of grew up in majority white churches, and you know, I'd love to hear kind of what that. I know you said that you kind of got used to it being almost like the norm and being in those spaces. But I think it's probably fair to say that, you know, now the contribution of people from ethnic minorities and global majority heritage communities to the church in the UK has been amazing and immense, and actually that Black and minority ethnic churches are actually growing significantly, especially in places like London, as you mentioned. But yeah, what would you say, sort of, if we looked at kind of what we see more broadly in society, how do you think this issue of race sort of looks at the moment in the church?
The past few years has seen significant movement and appetite to talk about these issues, to hear from Black and brown people within church congregations about what it is that they experience as people who might exist in white majority churches. But I think the church isn't as separate as it should be from these issues of polarization, political polarization, culture wars, and we've kind of got wrapped up into that. As you noted, not every church in the UK is full of white people. Theos did a report called Religious London. The fastest growing churches in predominantly cities in the UK are full of immigrants from other places who have kind of brought their Christianity from within their context to the UK, while the white majority population within churches is probably in decline. I'd say that it's a really complicated issue when it comes to the entanglement of white superiority with Christianity. My great-grandfather was a priest in the Anglican Church in Nigeria. He was ordained in 1940. And he and my great-grandmother used to run a school for Christian wives, where people who were about to get married would come and stay with them to learn what it meant to be good Christian wives. But what that in essence meant was they were taught how to bake cakes and drink tea and what kind of dresses to wear, in a way that the kind of Christianity was entangled with not just whiteness but Britishness. And I think that still pervades the church today, this idea that it's almost like when we talk about Christianity often as it's often characterized as the white man's religion, right, or a European religion. We talk about how Western civilization is based on Christian values, so that it feels like Christianity is part of what it is to be British. There's all sorts of interesting things going on in terms of looking at the census data and the people who would still describe themselves as Christian. A lot of them would be kind of cultural Christians who kind of associate and link the two things. So how does that play out within the church? It plays out in very simplistically in white imagery of Jesus and God, in the stories that we tell about what it is to be Christian, in the kinds of worship that we are used to in many churches in the UK. So I grew up thinking, well, actually, I was a strange child who, when I was 7, 8, would sit in my room alone and sing through the Songs and Hymns of Fellowship books. So I thought, the sound of worship to God was Graham Kendrick, right? and then when I got older, it was Hillsong, kind of very, very white. And actually, there are, if we believe that God is God, then God has got to be more than white Britishness or white Westernness. So there needs to be a way to reflect the diversity of the kingdom of God in the churches that we're part of. I could go on and on, but it's good. There's so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It's so interesting what you say, Chine. I think particularly given the fact that Christianity is born out of a Middle Eastern culture, not a Western culture, and also given the centrality of the incarnation in the Christian faith, that God in the person of Jesus Christ becomes flesh and blood in a particular context, and the challenge and opportunity is to respond in ways that are appropriate and life-giving and redemptive, whatever our cultural context is. So you would have thought that if any religious tradition could deal with this well, it would be the Christian faith. Um, why do you think we might not always be dealing with it quite as well as we could?
Christian theology and Christian practice takes place within a context where whiteness and Europeanness are seen as almost like the default human, the kind of normative way of being. So the incarnation, as you say, it should mean that we see Christianity being outworked and outlived in different cultural contexts. And sometimes I think people can fall into the trap of thinking, well, obviously we do Christianity in the kind of white British way because we are white British, but in other contexts it will look different. And that's true to some extent. But what we don't appreciate, I don't think, is the fact that in Nigeria or in India or in other places around the world where most people are black and brown, in those contexts, Christianity is still aligned with whiteness and Europeanness. So Jesus is pictured as a white person. And what that reflects is the kind of global reality that the kind of the global north, the Western powers and cultures and ideas pervade so many different cultures. Um, so, so the fact of the incarnation should mean that that is not the case, but it is, and that's one of the things that I think is really problematic um, in, I guess, Christianity's alignment with those kind of powers.
And I guess part of that is obviously in recent history has been the impact of missionaries who came from the West and brought the Christian faith to other non-white cultural contexts, but also perhaps in the process brought more than the gospel, but also brought a lot of their cultural assumptions and ways of being. Do you think if we look to the future, Christianity is no longer predominantly white and it is no longer predominantly the global north, in numerical terms, even if the influence continues to be there? Increasingly, the dominant empires are certainly not the British Empire, it's China, it's India. And of course, we're seeing a significant migration into the UK and the rest of the West from the rest of the world. So do you think that whole dynamic is going to change? In other words, increasingly here in the West, we're going to be influenced by expressions of Christianity that look more Asian or more African.
I think logically you would expect that to be the case, but there is something that makes me hesitate about whether that would really happen. I think there is sometimes, in our work at Theos, we talk a lot about kind of secularization theory and how that's been disproved, and we talk about these the numbers that the global South is seeing kind of rises in religious belief, but there is something in the kind of Western intellectual mind that almost I can hear people thinking, well, that's because they are not enlightened. And if they were to come here, then obviously we would have more of an effect on them than they would have on us. There is still this resistance, I think, to be influenced in kind of intellectually, theologically, by Christian ideas that come from elsewhere, because clearly there are lots of Christian thinkers around the world who write books, who think deeply about what it means to live the Christian faith within a different cultural context. But I find it hard to name those people. I can name many Americans and I can name lots of British people. I might be able to name some Australians, but it still feels like there is a hold on, I guess, Christian ideas that comes from this kind of global north. However, I guess I would hope that in the same way as our music is influenced by places around the world, or the way in which we dress, that our theology or kind of our practice might be more inclusive. But I would have expected to see a bit more of that at this point in history than I have.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think we're all very grateful that increasingly our food is influenced by other countries around the world.
Yeah.
And most people think that's a really good thing, but it's interesting if that's not reflected in other aspects of culture and then in theology. Let's talk about the Christian story, and step back and think about the way that might help us to frame or reframe our experience of and approach to race. If you were to think of the Christian story and start to narrate that for us, how would you see that unpacking, explaining issues around race and identity?
I would always start with the incarnation, as we've already been talking about. This idea that God steps into our cultural context, into the human body. It is, interesting, fascinating that Jesus was a brown-skinned person. So there's this idea of kind of incarnation, cultural context, and that includes white British contexts and cultures. That doesn't exclude. It's not saying that um, the kind of predominant culture here is bad. God steps into that too. So I think for each of us as Christians, there is this call to live out and work out what our faith says about the places in which we are, the bodies in which we inhabit, and what that means for us in terms of human flourishing. But I also think if you kind of go back to the Old Testament and the kind of earliest books of the Bible, I find it interesting that the slave Bible, which was a very reduced, truncated version of what the Bible was that slave owners gave or created for enslaved people, which had just 14 books in it. The things that they took out of that, to me, speak to who God is, what Christianity should be, and what it should mean for us as people of different cultures. So, gone were stories of the Exodus, anything that gave people the idea that God thought of them as special and thought about their own flourishing, and thought about how it was that they could escape injustice and unjust practices. So, we didn't see anything from in the slave Bible. Gone was Jeremiah 22. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness. Gone was Exodus 21. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall be surely be put to death. But what was emphasized was the kind of, I guess, some of the kind of the Ephesians passages that talk about servants being obedient to their masters. So I think if we look in the bits that were taken out, that is where we find what the Christian story says to all of us about what the kingdom of God is, a place where there aren't those unjust practices, where people are recognized as being made in God's image, worthy of inherent dignity, worth, and value because of that. So that to me is what the Christian story is. And we also see in the early stories, or the stories of the early church, something really radical, messy, interesting going on in how they lived life together. We read in Ephesians 2 about the dividing wall of hostility being broken down. We read in Galatians about there being neither Gentile nor Jew, neither male nor female. This coming together of people who are completely different, who together don't necessarily look like they fit together, who almost contravene what it is that society says that they should be and how they should behave and how they should live together. And that to me is a real example of how I think the church should be today, which is recognizing that each of us is made in God's image, but we each bring to the family of God, the church, our different cultures and contexts and the different people that we are. And that will include some messiness. It's not going to be easy. It's not that we're all going to conform to a particular culture. But yet it's in that mess that I think the beauty of the Christian story is, and that God steps into that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm really struck, Chine, that you started with incarnation. We were speaking with Laura Young on a previous podcast about the climate and ecological crisis. And I was struck that Laura, like you, Laura started actually with the atonement rather than with creation. And similarly, you've started with the doctrine of the incarnation, or the event of the incarnation, as opposed to creation, which I think is really interesting. Let's talk then a bit more about eschatology. And I'm struck that there is this tension, or there appears to be a tension in the New Testament, which on the one hand is an emphasis that in Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free. So those categories are no longer significant. They're certainly not divisive categories. At the same time, there is this vision of a new heaven and new earth that is presented in Scripture, where every tribe and language is represented. And it seems that the existence of those distinctive tribes and languages really matters, that it is something to be positive about, that it is part of the glorious diversity of all creation. So how would you kind of navigate your way through that as you think of the new heaven and new earth? I mean, I suppose my question is, what does that look like in regard to race and ethnicity?
Yeah, I think we start at diversity being good and diversity being inherent in the Trinity, in the personhood of God and the creativity of God. If you think about all of the different types of people and cultures and colours that there are, that is a good thing and a beautiful thing. But I think there's a difference between issues of justice and issues of identity, I guess, and kind of separating those two things. I think we can't shy away from the fact that horrific injustices have been done against particular people groups at particular points in history because of the brokenness of human beings, because of the quest for power and dominance, because of almost this kind of strive to be like God in some way, also fear of the other. These are things that have been present throughout human history. And I think that those issues of justice can't just be smoothed over by people saying things like, yes, slavery has ended, and actually God calls you to forget your race, kind of lay it down as you kind of walk into a church building or the church community. I find those conversations happen because of defensiveness or people's fear about kind of engaging with the real difficulty of the evils that have been done in the past. However, the challenge, I guess, for Christians like me who are Black or who are part of people groups who have faced those injustices is, yes, we want to address those injustices and assert our rights and highlight the wrongs that have been done in the past. And yet for us, there's also that call to a family of God that doesn't kind of cling to issues of human identity. And this is something I'm kind of wrestling with and learning. For each of us, there is a call to lay things down hold things lightly. Any sense of power, striving for more stuff or positions, or all of these things that I think have been taken away from Black people in the past. So I think there is a balance between those two things. I think it's not about just rights and justice and almost kind of getting what's due to me, but it's also, when it comes to it, it's a laying down of everything as part of what it is to be someone who follows Christ. It means even those bits that I hold as really important parts of my identity, even those things need to be laid down. And that's really difficult. It's really difficult for me to kind of wrestle with that as someone who, thinks about these issues of racial justice a lot. I guess I'm on my own journey of thinking what that means for me personally as someone who follows Christ.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Chine. Let me ask you a question. This might seem a strange question, but I suppose what I'm wanting to ask is, do you see racism, and this is then exploring maybe more of the second act of the great drama of Scripture, the sort of our kind of fallenness, the fallenness of creation. Do you see racism as being part of the human condition, or something that is a particular issue for white people? In other words, to what extent is this actually a human problem that, of course, will express itself differently at different points in history due to different cultural circumstances, but nonetheless, human beings do seem to have a tendency to other people, and a tendency to prioritize or prefer that which is like themselves, and a tendency to at times demonize that which they do not understand or know. Talk to us a little bit about that, if you would, please.
So I think it's part of the human condition to build walls around ourselves and our families and our communities, and separate ourselves from others. I think that comes from wanting power. It also comes from fear and anxiety about safety and security for ourselves. I see this even in, I'm from Nigeria. If I speak to a Nigerian will say to me, which tribe are you from? And I'll say, I'm Igbo. And then if I'm speaking to another Igbo person, they'll say, okay, but which state are you from? And I'll say, this state. Which town are you from? We kind of have this constant strive almost to belong to something and separate ourselves from the other. And that's, as you said, has outworked itself in different ways throughout history. I think, though, that there is something particular about whiteness that is a result of, 2,000 or so years of white European dominance over most of the world. And I think that there is a hold that it has over people that they might not recognize because they are part of the kind of dominant white group. And the reason why I kind of sense there's something else going on sometimes is, I speak to a lot of white people or white churches about race, and I can kind of see this kind of defensiveness, like rather than recognize that, yes, okay, we all have our prejudices, and actually I'm going to recognize that I do have these unconscious biases towards Black and brown people. The kind of holding on to that kind of sense of, I am a good person, actually, even though, and then the Christian story says actually we're not. There is something else that goes on. I don't think it's individual white people that are sometimes it is individual white people that are the problem, but it's as a result of many centuries of whiteness being held up as superior. And I think it takes a long time, it will take us a long time to get rid of that kind of sense of white supremacy or white superiority that sees anything other than white as in some way less. It's pretty challenging kind of conversation. But yes, we all build rules. Yes, we other people. But I think there is something about white superiority that is a little bit different.
Chine, before we wrap up, you've spoken honestly about your own kind of journey in terms of things you were speaking about, this idea of, there being some things that we have to kind of lay down and when we come to sort of rights and justice and what that looks like in the new creation. But I wondered if we could sort of loop back round to an example that came to mind in terms of what we see in our politics today or in recent times. What would be your view in light of kind of everything you've shared about the UK paying reparations for its involvement with the slave trade?
Yeah, that's an easy one.
Easy one to end on.
So I think that talking about reparations is a good thing. And I think that we have to ask ourselves why it is that there is a defensiveness, a reluctance to even kind of engage in the conversation about what it is that the UK could do. I think I've been a little bit linked with, or worked a little bit on the Church of England's kind of the Church Commissioners Reparations Fund, the £100 million fund that they have created, which will in effect help to fund kind of Black ideas, businesses, organisations in the coming years. Now, I know how much criticism that fund has received. But I think the reality is that so much of the UK's wealth is because of the kind of exploitation of Black people over the centuries. Now, we can choose to kind of say that that was in the past and let's move on, or we can say, well, actually, don't we want to live in a world in which we might want to address wrongs of the past in some way? And what reparations might look like, it might be financial repayments. It doesn't necessarily have to be, £10 going to every Black person in the world. It's nothing like that. But the kind of spirit of repair and wanting to do something about the injustices of the past, I think, is a good one. Now, the criticism might be that, well, there are lots of kind of white people living in poverty in the UK. I think that we should help them too. I don't think we need to pit people against each other who are living in poverty or who have faced injustices. I think the spirit of wanting to make repair is a good one that we should at least explore rather than be defensive about.
No, that's a helpful and honest answer. So thank you. Obviously, aside from your own book, are there any other books that you, or maybe resources that have been particularly influential on your own journey that you would recommend to people listening to this if they want to kind of, I suppose, grow their knowledge and insight in this area? What should they read? What should they listen to?
Yeah, in 2020, when I was writing the book, I kind of devoured Black theology books, most of which I hadn't read at all before that point. So I always recommend James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. James Cone, the Black liberation theologian. It's a short book, but it is extremely powerful. It talks about Jesus' solidarity with the oppressed. And I'd also recommend In Fleshing Freedom by M. Sean Copeland, who is a Black womanist Catholic theologian, who again talks about kind of race in the image of God and kind of among enslaved people. And just one more, which is not a Christian book, I'd say that everyone should read Emma Dabiri's What White People Can Do Next. which is, again, short but impactful book.
Brilliant. Well, a few to add to the reading list there for sure. Chine, thank you so much for joining us today. We've really appreciated hearing from you, as I say, so openly and honestly on this topic. What are you working on at the moment, and how can people keep track of what you're up to if they'd like to?
Well, Theos is up to lots of exciting things, projects, research. We work on productivity and death, and a new project on motherhood, and AI, and the economy, and science and religion. Lots of stuff there. So theosthinktank.co.uk. And then I've just finished the first draft of my next book, which is called Unmaking Mary, The Myth of Divine Motherhood, although the title might change, which is about motherhood and Mary, and will be out in February 2025.
Wonderful. Well, we will keep our eyes peeled for that. But yeah, thank you so much, Chine. It's been really great chatting to you today.
Well, very interesting indeed. Grace, what were your takeaways from that conversation with Chine?
Yeah, absolutely interesting and challenging, I think, Paul. I think, I sort of felt aware going into this conversation that it's an important one to talk about. And I'm really glad we've done this episode. But I think it just feels very complex. And I think I was very struck with part of what Chine was saying about there being this kind of something specific about kind of white supremacy and white dominance, which is kind of different, and people, she mentioned, didn't she, sometimes in her conversations with church leaders or people in kind of places of influence within the church, especially, where she'll bring up this topic and actually she's kind of met with this kind of this defensiveness. And I think I felt very convicted as well of just how, I think when you are someone who's in the ethnic majority, we can just be so blind to things without even realizing. And actually the fact that, that sometimes that means that we don't even come into those conversations with the open minds that we should. And also, I suppose, just thinking about the difference between Chine's upbringing. I thought it was really interesting how she said that, basically in every sphere of her life growing up from when she was 4 years old, she was, often the only Black woman in the room. And actually, just in some ways, I would have loved to have spoken to her more about that, what that was actually. I thought it was remarkable how she kind of said, I just got used to that being the norm. But actually, I sort of think, wow, that's, that's obviously, that wasn't my experience at school, but actually that's quite formative in its own way, isn't it, in terms of, especially as a child as young as 4 and 5. I also I liked what she said about when we think about the incarnation, and interesting that topic kind of keeps coming up in this series, but how God steps into our cultural context, but actually my cultural context is different to another person's, but neither is in the kingdom of God more or less valid. And how actually, I think, I loved how she kind of said, especially when it comes to the concept of, church, actually, how rich and she said messy, didn't she? Like how messy it would be and should be, actually, when, if we all, if the church service contain, the church I'm at the moment is actually a very diverse congregation, probably by far the most diverse that I've ever been in. And actually, I often think, wouldn't, if actually there was a part of the service that reflected each and every one of those cultures in the room, actually how amazing that would be. And I think that, when she spoke about, because you asked a question, didn't you, about, what do we think the future looks like? Do we think there will be more influences and expressions of other, other races and other sort of, groups within British culture? And she sort of was quite hesitant, wasn't she, in the sense of sort of saying, well, actually, again, there's this kind of strong dominance within Britishness, which means that we're sometimes, even without probably being intentional about it, just have these kind of unconscious biases, which mean that we're sort of pushing back against embracing, difference, embracing different cultural expressions. So yeah, I feel challenged, but I think she was a brilliant person to have to speak into this. And I'm also intrigued and looking forward to her next book, which sounds very,
Yes,
very
it does, doesn't
fascinating.
it? Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, I
how
think
about
it's
you, Paul? Go on, sorry.
well, I was just going to say that the defensiveness thing is really interesting, isn't it? Because
Mm,
um, you sort of the sort of well, the kind of your instincts are to respond as well. I'm not defensive. I'm not the
yeah,
least defensive.
yeah.
I'm absolutely and realize that oh gosh, I possibly am a bit defensive. And I suppose an awareness of that is important. I do
Mm,
think there is probably a tendency for people in every culture. Um, and every place, every moment in time to create God in their own image. I think that is
yeah,
part of our human condition. And I guess there is something particular about whiteness because of the historical moment that we're in. That the reality is that Western Europe has had extraordinary influence over the past couple of thousand years, and we live with that. And in a sense, there's very little we can do with that. That is just the way it is.
mm,
But then we need to navigate the world, recognizing this is the way it is, but seeking to live well and redemptively in that context. At the same
mm,
time, it would seem to me that there are other empires that are emerging, and the world could look very different. In fact, of
yeah.
course, it will 2,000 years from now, but even 50 years from now, even 100 years from now, in a sense, there is always empire. There are always those groups that have particular power and influence and then shape and sometimes impose their ways of thinking and traditions on others. And we kind of have to deal with the mess of that a little bit and try and
Mm,
live authentically in those contexts. So I thought that was, as you say, it was really interesting. It was thought provoking and challenging. I thought Chine's emphasis on the incarnation, I commented on it at the time, but I thought was so interesting that that was where she started, rather
mm,
than say creation,
mm,
but something in the sort of the particularity of God um, uh, becoming a human being in the person of Jesus Christ in a particular context at a particular point in
time,
time.
yeah.
Somehow that actually speaks to the universal significance and relevance of Christ for all people in their particular contexts and particular points in time. So I thought it was really interesting, and I also thought um, there was quite a lot of self-reflection on Chinny's part, actually, in terms of her own upbringing, and
Mm,
particularly when she was talking about Nigeria and her tribe and the sort of
mm,
conversations she has with people. I think there was a sort of awareness around some of the complexity of these things. And I guess that with an issue like this, a question like this, often it can be we're prone to reductionism, aren't we, and to caricatures.
yeah.
And I think Chinny was very keen to avoid that, and therefore was a model really to the rest of us of how we try and navigate these things thoughtfully, without trying to um, minimize, if you like, the challenge that is presented to us.
Yeah.
So I thought it was helpful, and I thought, yeah, if our podcast, Grace, is about trying to connect the Christian story with all of life, and today we're particularly focused on race, I think there is a lot from that conversation that can
Mm,
really help us.
yeah, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. And a great a great episode.
Yeah, well, thank you, Grace, and
Thank you.
thank you for listening, everyone. And if you enjoyed this episode of The Whole Life, we would, of course, love you to give us a follow, leave a review, tell your friends about it. But until next time, from Grace and me, that was The Whole Life. Goodbye, and please join us again soon.
Bye everyone.